Resident Evil is a series that has allowed countless depraved minds to fester, all villains obsessed with achieving grand power, revenge, or even something as simple as wealth. But it all boils down to the same evil, an unfathomable selfishness. But what about when a villain is so deeply obsessed with somebody else, they're willing to do anything to follow in their footsteps? Well, that's exactly the case with Victor Gideon, a man so inspired by Oswell E. Spencer's legacy that he would go as far as to kidnap, murder, and experiment on children to continue what he thought to be Spencer's grand vision. In this video, we'll be diving into the dark story of Victor Gideon and how he became the obsessed Spencer fanboy that he is. So, let's get right into it. To understand who Dr. Victor Gideon really is, we have to go back to before the fall of Umbrella. Prior to the Raccoon City incident in 1998, Gideon worked as a researcher within the Umbrella Corporation, specifically studying the T-virus. And like many within the company, he didn't just respect Oswell E. Spencer, he idolized him. To Gideon, Spencer wasn't just a scientist or businessman, he was a visionary, someone who understood that humanity in its current state was fundamentally flawed and needed to evolve. But here's the interesting part. Despite how much Gideon admired Spencer and his ideals, he was never actually a part of Spencer's inner circle. He wasn't involved in the most secretive projects, he didn't have access to ARC, and more importantly, he knew nothing about Spencer's work on memory transfer, or the existence of Elpis. Those secrets were kept locked away by Spencer himself, even as Umbrella expanded beyond his control and eventually collapsed. After the Raccoon City outbreak, Umbrella was dragged into what became known as the Raccoon Trials, a series of legal proceedings meant to expose the company's involvement in the disaster. Gideon was called in to testify, but he never showed up. In fact, at that point, he had completely disappeared. No one could track him, and no one knew where he went. And then, after Umbrella officially collapsed in 2004, he resurfaced. Gideon purchased a medical facility known as the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, located on the outskirts of Renwood. The institution itself had previously been funded by the Spencer Foundation, which already ties it directly back to Umbrella's legacy. From the outside, it looked like a normal care facility, but behind the scenes, it became something else entirely. Around the same time, a shadowy organization known as the Connections began recovering whatever they could from Umbrella's remains. Research data, experimental notes, anything Spencer had left behind. Eventually, they discovered something major. ARC, Spencer's private laboratory, and with it, the truth about his most secret experiments. Through the Connections, Gideon finally learned about Spencer's research into memory transfer, the idea that a person's consciousness could be preserved and passed on through biological means. But instead of simply studying it, Gideon took it further, much further. Using cloned children as test subjects, Gideon began injecting them with a combination of Spencer's preserved plasma and modified strains of the T-virus, attempting to recreate the conditions necessary for memory transfer. At the same time, he also learned about something else. Elpis, Spencer's final project. But there was a problem. Almost all information about Elpis had been completely locked down. The only thing that had leaked was that it had the potential to completely shift the balance of power on a global scale. And Gideon came to his own conclusion. If Spencer's life work was centered around evolution, and ultimately becoming a god, then Elpis had to be the final step. Gideon believed it wasn't just another virus, he believed it was a perfected strain of the T-virus, one capable of controlling others, not just mutating them, but dominating them. It was the key to fulfilling Spencer's vision, so Gideon made it his mission to find it and unleash it. But in order to do that, he needed access, and that's when he discovered something that completely changed his approach. Spencer had adopted a child shortly before his death, a girl named Grace. Gideon became convinced that this wasn't just some random act of kindness. He believed Grace was the result of Spencer's memory transfer experiments, a living vessel carrying Spencer's consciousness, which meant she might be the key to unlocking Elpis. With the help of the Connections, Gideon managed to obtain fragments of Grace's medical records in late 2004, and from that point on, everything he did revolved around one goal: recreating her. For over 2 decades, Gideon worked in secret alongside a high-ranking member of the Connections known as Zeno, hiding his experiments from the outside world. Inside the Rhodes Hill facility, victims were abducted, imprisoned, and subjected to horrific experimentation. They were infected with constantly evolving strains of the T-virus, all in an attempt to harvest usable biological material. Meanwhile, child clones were created and modeled after Grace, using the incomplete data Gideon had obtained. Each time he would adjust the virus, each time he would get closer, and every single time, they died. To Gideon, these weren't children, they were failures, and according to Zeno, they were completely useless. By this point, Gideon had been chasing the same goal for over a decade, and he was getting nowhere. 14 years after obtaining Grace's medical records, he still hadn't been able to track down Alyssa or her daughter. The two of them constantly moved from place to place, following Alyssa's work as a freelance journalist. Every time Gideon got close, they were already gone. But eventually, he caught a break. Gideon learned that Alyssa had taken a job in Wrenwood, the same area where his facility, the Rhodes Chronic Care Center, was located. For the first time in years, Grace was within reach, so Gideon made his move. He sent an assassin, a man infected with the T virus, with two very specific orders: capture Grace and eliminate Alyssa. For 2 whole days, the man stalked Alyssa while she worked inside a cafe, carefully watching her movements and waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, on the night of October 19th, 2018, Gideon personally made a call to room 204 of the Wrenwood Hotel. When Grace answered and confirmed her identity, that was all Gideon needed. The plan was set in motion.
Hello?
Miss Ashcroft?
Yes.
Moments later, the assassin triggered a blackout, plunging the entire hotel into darkness. But things didn't go as planned. Alyssa had already grown suspicious. She had noticed the man watching them and realized something wasn't right. Believing that Grace was the target, she decided they needed to leave immediately. As they tried to escape, they encountered the hotel manager, and within seconds, he was dead, killed in a sudden, brutal attack during the blackout. Alyssa fought back, managing to shoot the assassin multiple times, buying just enough time for them to get away and find a temporary safe location. But the danger wasn't over. As Grace began to panic, overwhelmed by everything that had just happened, Alyssa tried to calm her down, and that's when it happened. The assassin, barely alive, had followed them. He emerged from the darkness and attacked. This time, Alyssa didn't make it. She was killed right in front of her daughter, but even then, the plan still failed. The assassin succumbed to his injuries before he could capture Grace. As he collapsed, he knocked over an oil lamp, setting the hotel ablaze and turning the entire scene into chaos. By the next morning, Gideon had already moved to clean everything up. On October 20th, he sent in a disposal team to erase any evidence that could link the incident back to him or the care center. To the outside world, it was just another tragic event. But for Grace, it changed everything. The trauma forced her into isolation, making her far more difficult to track down. And for Gideon, it meant one thing. After all those years of planning, he was still empty-handed. By this point, nearly 3 decades had passed since the destruction of Raccoon City, but the nightmare Umbrella created wasn't over. Around 28 years after the outbreak, Gideon began noticing something strange. A new illness had started appearing, primarily affecting survivors of the Raccoon City incident. One of the most noticeable symptoms was the appearance of dark, almost bruised markings spreading across the body. At first, it didn't make much sense. But after studying it more closely, Gideon realized what was actually happening. The T virus had never been truly eliminated. Even after treatments like the T vaccine and daylight, traces of the virus had remained dormant inside certain individuals. And over time, those traces had begun to evolve. The virus was adapting. It was building resistance to the host's immune system, and eventually overpowering it. Gideon gave this condition a name, latent onset T virus syndrome, but more commonly, he referred to it as something else, Raccoon City syndrome or Umbrella's curse. The illness progressed through 3 distinct stages, becoming highly contagious once fully activated, and worst of all, it had a 100% mortality rate. There was no cure. Even Gideon, with all of his knowledge, couldn't find a way to stop it, but instead of seeing this as a failure, he saw it as another opportunity. Sometime before October of 2026, Gideon took things a step further. He implanted himself with a modified Nemesis Gamma parasite, embedding it directly into his own chest. The parasite enhanced his physical strength and durability to levels similar to a Nemesis-type BOW, but unlike traditional tyrants, Gideon was still able to retain full control of his mind, at least for now. Around the same time, Gideon brought in 2 more child clones from ARC. Their names were Marie and Emily. referred to internally as Subject 170 and 171. Like the others before them, these girls were raised inside the care center and subjected to continuous T-virus experimentation in an attempt to recreate what Gideon believed Grace to be, a perfect vessel. But once again, the results were a failure. Marie's mental state deteriorated rapidly. Eventually, she lost all sense of identity, burrowed into the lower levels of the facility, and mutated into a creature that could only survive in darkness, becoming extremely sensitive to ultraviolet light. Emily's case was different. Her body didn't mutate in the same way, but she gradually lost her vision, developing severe cataracts. She was kept alive, isolated behind a glass containment cell, constantly monitored for any signs of further change. Neither of them were what Gideon was looking for, and as time went on, he became more desperate. By September of 2026, Gideon still hadn't given up on finding Grace. This time, he decided to take a different approach. He hired a private investigator named MD Birdie from the RGT Detective Agency and tasked him with locating her. Eventually, Gideon got his answer. Grace had joined the FBI. She was working as an intelligence analyst, completely dedicated to her job. She rarely left her home, had little to no personal life, and had almost completely isolated herself from the outside world. In other words, she was hard to reach, but not impossible. Around the same time, Zeno arrived at the care center for a full review of Gideon's progress. And while Gideon had made advancements, they weren't good enough. The results still didn't meet the expectations of the connections. So, as a precaution, the organization manipulated the government into extending the quarantine around Raccoon City all the way to the year 2040. Then they gave Gideon a clear directive: release Elpis before time runs out. Gideon, now fully convinced, believed he had finally figured everything out. He told Zeno that Grace wasn't just another survivor. She was the successful result of Spencer's experiment, the one carrying his memory, the one capable of unlocking Elpis. And by the end of September, things started getting worse. Across the United States, more and more survivors of Raccoon City began dying from the syndrome. The virus was spreading, the clock was ticking, and Gideon was running out of time. At this point, Gideon knew exactly what he needed to do. If he couldn't find Grace on his own, he would make her come to him. Using Zeno and the connection's influence within the government, Gideon manipulated the situation from the shadows. He arranged for the FBI to take over an investigation, and more importantly, made sure that Grace would be assigned to it. The location? The same place where everything fell apart years earlier, the Wrenwood Hotel. To set the stage, Gideon planted the body of a 5th Raccoon City survivor inside the building, someone who had recently died from Raccoon City syndrome. On September 28th, the body was discovered by FBI agent Kyle Eames, officially reopening the case. Then, 10 days later, Grace arrived. She was assigned to the site by her supervisor, tasked with providing a technical analysis of the scene. But from the moment she stepped inside the hotel, everything had already been planned. Gideon was waiting. Every step she took led her deeper into the trap. Eventually, she was drawn back to the same place where it all happened, room 204. Inside, Gideon had laid out dozens of photos, documenting her life, tracking her movements, proving that he had been watching her for years. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a confirmation. Gideon needed to be sure. After a brief silent phone call with no response on the other end, he finally got his answer. This was Grace. And once he knew that, he made his move. To slow things down, Gideon used a dart gun loaded with the T-virus to infect a nearby officer, Norman Cole. Within moments, Cole turned, forcing Grace into a desperate struggle for survival. The confrontation ended with Cole's death, but that was just the beginning. As Grace continued through the hotel, she eventually reached the top floor, and there he was, Gideon, calm, composed, sitting there listening to classical music. As if none of this was out of the ordinary. When Grace confronted him, Gideon didn't deny anything. In fact, he openly admitted how long this had taken, how difficult the process had been. Before Grace could react, he grabbed her and choked her unconscious. And just like that, she was his. Outside the hotel, Gideon carried Grace's unconscious body as he made his way back to the care center. But he wasn't alone. Leon Kennedy had arrived. Realizing he needed to buy time, Gideon didn't hesitate. He began infecting civilians nearby using his dart gun, turning them into weapons and triggering a small-scale outbreak right in the middle of the city. With Leon forced to deal with the chaos, Gideon slipped away. He returned to the Rhodes Hill facility and brought Grace with him. There, he strapped her to a gurney and immediately began running tests. He injected her with a compound known as Dexafil, then began extracting blood samples, analyzing her biology in an attempt to confirm his theory. Afterward, he left her restrained inside the East Wing hospital wards. At this point, Gideon had already gotten what he came for, which meant he no longer needed the care center, so he gave the order. To his subordinate, Chairman Mitchell Bennett, Gideon activated something known as Code 6, and when the DSO arrived that night, everything changed. The moment Leon entered the facility, Gideon triggered the protocol. Through hidden systems and infected vectors, the entire building was turned into a death trap. Staff, patients, everyone inside was infected. As Leon pushed through the chaos, he eventually reunited with Grace, who had regained consciousness but still had no idea why she was being targeted. But before they could escape, Gideon locked the entire facility down. Metal shutters slammed into place, separating them, and from the shadows, Gideon began speaking. He started to have a conversation with Leon, but he wasn't interested and attacked immediately, and that's when it became clear Gideon wasn't just a scientist anymore. With the enhancements from the Nemesis Gamma parasites, Gideon completely overpowered Leon, choking him unconscious with ease. As Leon faded out, Gideon noticed something: the symptoms, the markings. He recognized it instantly: Raccoon City Syndrome, or as he called it, Umbrella's Curse. Leon was dragged away to the attic where Gideon planned to interrogate him, and for hours, Leon was left there unconscious. Meanwhile, Gideon went searching for Grace, and eventually he found her. Inside one of the offices, Grace managed to catch him off guard, holding him at gunpoint and demanding answers. Why her? Why all of this? But Gideon didn't see himself as the villain. In his mind, he was saving her.
Why did you kidnap me?
Kidnap you? I liberated you.
He told Grace that she was the key to unlocking Elpis, that she had been chosen, shaped by someone greater, by her master, Spencer. Terrified of being captured again, Grace tried to outsmart him. She staged a fake escape, slipping out of sight and hiding nearby. Gideon searched for her, trying to draw her out, but this time he failed.
Grace!
Hours later, Gideon returned to the attic. Leon had woken up, and once again, Gideon tried to get answers out of him, but Leon didn't break.
When the last time you brushed your teeth?
So Gideon changed tactics. He pulled out a scalpel and cut into Leon's neck. The interrogation turned into torture, but even then, Leon managed to fight back, breaking free from his restraints and attacking Gideon. Still, it wasn't enough. Gideon escaped. From there, he moved quickly. He made his way to the courtyard, took the key from his pilot, cutting off any easy escape, and headed down into the underground lab beneath the facility. This was it, the moment he had been working towards for decades. Inside the lab, Gideon analyzed Grace's blood, and when the results came back, it was a perfect match. The same data he had been chasing for years. The same blueprint he had tried to recreate over and over again. Gideon immediately contacted Zeno, barely able to contain his excitement. All those years of failure, all those experiments, and it finally paid off. And just like that, he initiated the self-destruct sequence. The care center had served its purpose. But what Gideon didn't realize was that Grace had overheard everything. She watched as the lab and all of his work went up in flames. With the facility collapsing and escape routes compromised, Gideon changed course. If he couldn't leave by helicopter, there was only one other place to go: the water treatment facility behind the care center. And that's where he waited, not for Leon, but for Grace. When she finally arrived, shaken and broken after everything she had just been through, including being forced to watch Emily, one of Gideon's former test subjects, seemingly die right in front of her, Gideon was ready. He told her that Elpis was in reach. Then he introduced her to the man behind everything, Zeno. Zeno told Grace the truth as he saw it, that she was connected to the destruction of Raccoon City, but was also the key to its salvation. And when Grace asked the one question that mattered, "What is Elpis?" For the first time, she didn't resist. She chose to go with them. Together, Gideon, Zeno, and Grace boarded a helicopter and headed straight for the ruins of Raccoon City. The following day, everything started to unravel. As Gideon and Zeno made their way toward the ruins of Raccoon City, an alert suddenly came through. One of their bugged BSAA systems had been triggered, and the person responsible was Leon. Zeno made it clear, handle it. So Gideon split off, leaving Grace with Zeno, who took her to the abandoned Raccoon City Police Department to try and secure her cooperation. Meanwhile, Gideon prepared for something else: a confrontation. After dropping them off, he and his pilot relocated, eventually arming himself with a motorbike and a rocket launcher. Then he waited. Positioned along the elevated highway leading into the city, Gideon set up his ambush, and when Leon finally arrived, it began. Gideon didn't hesitate, he opened fire immediately, launching rockets in an attempt to wipe Leon out before he could get any closer. At the same time, several Garmer BOWs closed in, turning the entire encounter into a high-speed pursuit. But Leon wasn't going down that easily. He weaved through the chaos, dodging both Gideon's attacks and the creatures chasing him. One by one, the Garmer were taken out, until eventually it was just the two of them, Gideon and Leon. Gideon revved his engine and charged forward, attempting to ram Leon head-on in a final decisive strike. But Leon saw it coming. At the last second, he struck Gideon's bike with his hatchet, damaging the fuel line. Gasoline began pouring out across the road, and in the next moment, Leon sent his bike ablaze with a single shot. The explosion sent Gideon flying. His body slammed across the highway before tumbling over the edge, disappearing into the chasm below. But the damage was already done. The blast had torn through him, and Gideon lost his arm in the process. For the first time in this entire story, he had been stopped. But he wasn't dead. He later reached the Ark facility and descended into the lower levels of Pandora, where he believed everything was about to fall apart. From the shadows, he overheard a conversation between Grace and Zeno, and in that moment, the truth was revealed. Elpis wasn't a weapon. It wasn't some perfected strain of the T-virus. It wasn't mind control. It wasn't evolution. It was the exact opposite. Elpis was an antiviral agent, something designed to neutralize every virus that came from the progenitor lineage. Everything Umbrella had created, everything Spencer had built, Elpis was meant to undo it. And Grace, she wasn't a clone. She wasn't the result of memory transfer. She wasn't carrying Spencer's consciousness. She was just a normal girl, an orphan, someone Spencer had taken in near the end of his life. And just like that, Gideon's entire worldview collapsed. Zeno turned on him immediately, furious that everything that he had been working toward was based on a misunderstanding. Gideon admitted it, the memory transfer experiments, they had nothing to do with Grace. Spencer's notes had been incomplete. The truth had been right there all along, and he got it wrong. But even then, Gideon refused to let go. Because to him, this didn't disprove Spencer's vision, it redefined it. Gideon convinced himself that Elpis wasn't meant to save the world, it was meant to break it. A tool to throw society into chaos, a reset button, a way to force humanity to evolve through destruction. In his mind, this was Spencer's final plan, and he was the one chosen to carry it out. But Zeno had heard enough. He declared that the connections were done with Gideon, and that was the last mistake that he made. In an instant, Gideon's body reacted. From the stump of his severed arm, a grotesque tentacle burst outward, and with a single motion, Zeno was decapitated. Grace tried to intervene, but she was too late. Gideon turned on her next, driving the same tentacle straight through her abdomen, leaving her collapsed and helpless. At this point, Gideon had completely lost it. He began entering commands into the system, trying to activate a self-destruct sequence while grabbing a vial of Elpis for himself. But in his obsession, he made a mistake. The password, it was all wrong. And while everything around them began to destabilize, Grace made one final move. Using her own vial of Elpis, she cured Leon of Raccoon City syndrome, finally removing the lingering effects of Umbrella's curse. The facility began to collapse. The ground gave way beneath them, and all three were sent crashing down to the lower levels. Grace was knocked unconscious, but Leon got back up, and standing in front of him was no longer a man. Gideon's body had fully mutated, his form twisted and expanded, multiple tentacles extending outward as he began absorbing electricity from the environment, weaponizing it against Leon. And as Leon pushed through the chaos, dealing more and more damage, Gideon's final transformation was triggered. The Nemesis parasite took over. His body grew into something massive, something inhuman, a monster driven by obsession, but even that wasn't enough. In the end, Leon brought him down. Using the Requiem, he delivered the final blows, tearing through Gideon's mutated body until it could no longer hold itself together. And just like that, Gideon was gone, his body breaking down, melting into nothing. And when you step back and really look at it, Gideon wasn't just another villain, he was something much worse. He was someone who believed so deeply in Spencer's vision that even when he was proven wrong, he twisted the truth just to keep believing. Because to Gideon, it was never about what Spencer actually created, it was about what he wanted Spencer's grand vision to be. But that's gonna do it for Victor Gideon's chapter, and if you made it this far, you're amazing. And if you want to support me even further, consider watching this video on Oswell Spencer's life story. Maybe you can get an idea of why Victor was so obsessed with his genius. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in a new one very soon.